The first round punched through the sandbag 6 inches from Kira O'Yellerin's head. She did not flinch. 1,800 meters across the valley, hidden somewhere in the rocks they called the spine, an enemy sniper was trying to kill her. He had already wounded 3 Marines. He had pinned down an entire patrol, and every sniper at Forward Operating Base Copperhead had failed to locate him. But Kira had found him. She had found him 30 seconds ago. The problem was that the shot between her and the man trying to kill Americans was literally impossible. 3 wind zones, an 18-inch gap between 2 rock formations, and 1,847 meters of Afghan mountain air that would bend any bullet into uselessness. She pressed her eye to the scope and made a decision that would change everything. 72 hours earlier, the helicopter touched down at FOB Copperhead in a cloud of brown dust that tasted like chalk and diesel. Kira grabbed her rifle case and dropped onto Afghan soil for the first time in her career. The Khyber Province mountains rose around her like broken teeth, and somewhere in those peaks, she knew, enemies watched every movement on this base. She had read the briefings. She knew the statistics. What she did not know was that the real enemy was already walking toward her across the landing zone. Before we continue with what happened next, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed someone being underestimated before, someone who proved everyone wrong. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Crenshaw was not a small man. He stood 6'2", with shoulders that looked like they had been carved from the same rock as the mountains around them. 20 years in the Marine Corps had taught him exactly one thing about Navy SEALs. They thought they were better than everyone else. And now SEAL Command had sent him one of their snipers for joint operations, which meant babysitting duty for the next 3 weeks. He had seen the personnel file. Petty Officer First Class O'Yellerin. Impressive scores. Classified training records. What the file had not mentioned, what no one had bothered to tell him, was that the SEAL sniper standing in front of him was a woman. Kira watched his face change. She had seen that expression before. The momentary confusion, the recalculation, the dismissal that followed. She had been seeing it her entire career. Crenshaw recovered quickly enough. He looked at her rifle case, then at her face, then back at the case, as if confirming that yes, this small woman was actually claiming to be a sniper. "You O'Yellerin," he said. It was not really a question. "Petty Officer First Class Kira O'Yellerin," she replied. "Reporting as ordered." He grunted and turned without offering to help with her gear. "This way." Command's idea of a joke, sending us a SEAL sniper right when things are heating up. "Hope you brought your sunscreen. Observation duty gets boring." Kira said nothing. She had learned years ago that words meant nothing to men like this. Only actions mattered. Only results. She followed him across the FOB, past Marines who stopped their work to stare, past the motor pool where a corporal actually dropped his wrench when he saw her, past the Tactical Operations Center where a lieutenant did a double take through the window. By the time they reached the barracks, Kira had counted 14 men who looked at her like she had wandered onto the wrong base. "The sniper team bunks are full," Crenshaw said without apology. "You will be in overflow housing." He pointed to a plywood structure at the edge of the FOB that looked like it had been built as an afterthought. "Chow is at 0600 and 1800. Range time is assigned by seniority. Since you have none here, you will get whatever slots nobody else wants." "Understood," Kira said. Crenshaw paused at the door. Something in her voice, or maybe her lack of reaction, seemed to irritate him. "Let me be clear about something. I do not care what your scores say. I do not care what SEAL Command thinks you can do. Out here, in these mountains, experience is what keeps people alive. And you do not have any." Kira met his eyes. She had faced harder stares from drill instructors, from combat veterans, from men who had tried to break her in every way imaginable. "I understand your concern, Gunnery Sergeant." "Do you?" His jaw tightened. "Because the last thing I need is some operator with something to prove getting my Marines killed." He walked away before she could respond. Not that she would have. Kira had stopped trying to change minds with word a long time ago. The overflow housing was exactly as depressing as it looked. A cot, a footlocker, and a single bulb that flickered every time the generator hiccuped. Kira set down her gear and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds to feel the weight of what she had walked into. Then she opened her rifle case and began her inspection routine, fingers moving over the weapon with the familiarity of 10,000 repetitions. At the bottom of her pack, wrapped in a cloth her mother had given her, was a leather journal so old the pages had turned yellow. Her grandfather's handwriting filled every page. Ballistic calculations, wind reading techniques, and stories. Stories about a black man in Vietnam who had made shots that should have been impossible, who had saved dozens of lives, and who had died without a single medal because the men in charge had refused to see what he could do. Kira touched the journal's cover. "I am here, grandfather," she whispered. "I will make them see." A knock on the door interrupted her. She opened it to find a young Marine, barely out of his teens, with a smirk that suggested he had drawn the short straw for this particular errand. "Corporal Maddox," he said, "Gunny sent me to show you where to stow your gear. I already have a footlocker." He looked past her at the sparse room and snorted. "Yeah, about that. Gunny says your rifle goes in the armory with everyone else's. Standard procedure." It was not standard procedure for a SEAL sniper, and they both knew it. But Kira simply nodded and reached for her rifle case. Maddox watched her with undisguised amusement. "So you're really a sniper, huh? Like an actual sniper?" "That is correct." He laughed, shaking his head. "What? The Navy run out of men?" Kira did not respond. Maddox leaned against the doorframe, enjoying himself now. "Look, no offense, but maybe you should just go play with dolls or something. Leave the real shooting to people who know what they are doing." The words hung in the air between them. Kira had heard variations of this her entire life. Go back to the kitchen. Stick to desk duty. Let the men handle this. Each time, she had responded the same way. With silence. With patience. With the absolute certainty that eventually she would have her chance to answer. "Thank you for the suggestion, Corporal. Now if you will show me to the armory." Maddox shrugged and led the way, still chuckling to himself about the female sniper who thought she belonged in a combat zone. That night, after the armory visit and the paperwork and the sideways glances from every Marine she passed, Kira lay on her cot and listened to the sounds of the FOB settling into darkness. Generators humming, distant laughter from a main barracks, the occasional bark of orders from the perimeter. She was nearly asleep when she heard voices outside her window. Crenshaw's voice, low but clear enough to understand. "Command wants to evaluate her." "Fine, we will evaluate her. By the time we are done, she will request transfer herself." The morning PT session began at 0500, when the Afghan mountains were still black shapes against a slowly brightening sky. Kira had been awake for an hour already, stretching in the darkness of her quarters, preparing her body for whatever test Crenshaw had planned. She was not disappointed. 6 miles, the gunnery sergeant announced to the assembled Marines. "Full gear." He glanced at Kira with something that might have been anticipation. "Try to keep up." She kept up, more than kept up. By mile 4, she had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, her pack bouncing against her spine with each stride. The Marines around her were struggling, sweat pouring down, faces twisted with effort. Kira's expression remained neutral. She had run harder distances in worse conditions during SEAL training, had pushed through pain that would have broken most people. 6 miles in the cool mountain morning was almost pleasant, but when they finished, when the Marines bent over gasping and congratulating each other on the time, not a single one acknowledged that she had finished in the top 5. Crenshaw marked something on his clipboard and walked away without a word. It was as if she had not been there at all. Range time came after breakfast. Kira had been assigned the last slot of the day, which meant shooting into the setting sun with visibility at its worst. She had also been given Lane 7, which every sniper on base knew was cursed with a broken windage turret that had never been properly repaired. She discovered the turret problem during her first shot, which landed 8 inches left of where it should have. The second shot confirmed it. The rifle was not the problem. The scope was. The range master, a staff sergeant named Fuentes, watched her from the observation platform with his arms crossed. He had dark hair cut close to his skull and eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked at. "First day on the range," he called down. "Having trouble already." Kira did not respond. She removed the scope from her rifle, examined it with practiced efficiency, and identified the problem within 30 seconds. A loose adjustment screw that someone had stripped by over-tightening. She could fix it, but not with the tools available at the range. Fuentes appeared at her station a few minutes later. "Scope's junk," he said. "Been meaning to replace it. Do you have a precision screwdriver set?" she asked. ".4 millimeters. He raised an eyebrow, but retrieved the set from the range shed. Kira worked in silence, her fingers steady despite the scrutiny. Within 10 minutes, she had improvised a repair using a technique her grandfather had taught her decades ago. It would not hold forever, but it would hold long enough. Her next 3 shots landed within a quarter inch of each other, dead center on the target at 500 meters. Fuentes said nothing, but she caught him looking at her target with an expression that was not quite dismissal. That evening, Kira heard the story of Crenshaw's brother. She was not meant to hear it. She had gone to the chow hall late, hoping to avoid the crowds, and had ended up at a table near the kitchen where 2 lance corporals were talking in voices they thought were private. "Gunny's been worse since they told him about the SEAL assignment," one of them said. "Reminds him of what happened to Tyler." Tyler Crenshaw. The name stuck in Kira's mind as she ate her meal without tasting it. She learned, through fragments of overheard conversation, that Tyler had been Wade Crenshaw's younger brother, that he had died 4 years ago during an operation in Helmand Province, that there had been a female officer involved somehow, and that Crenshaw blamed her for his brother's death. The details were unclear, disputed even among the Marines who told the story. But the conclusion was always the same. Crenshaw believed that women did not belong in combat roles, and his brother's death was the reason why. Kira returned to her quarters and opened her grandfather's journal. She needed to remember why she was here, why any of this mattered. Isaiah O'Yelleran had been 19 years old when he shipped out to Vietnam in 1967. A black man from rural Montana who had learned to shoot by hunting elk with his father, he had qualified as a sniper within weeks of arriving in country. His instructors had called him a natural, had marveled at his ability to read wind and distance, as if the information was being whispered directly into his ear. But the men he served with had not seen a natural. They had seen a black man holding a rifle, and that was enough to make them suspicious. He had been assigned to the worst positions, given the most dangerous missions, denied credit for kills that should have made him legendary. And still he had persevered. Still he had saved lives. Kira turned to a page she had read 100 times before. Her grandfather's handwriting, cramped and careful, describing a shot he had made in the Central Highlands. The distance had been over 1,700 meters. The wind had been shifting through 3 different patterns, and there had been an 18-inch gap between 2 trees that the bullet needed to thread in order to reach the enemy sniper who had pinned down his patrol. They said it was impossible. He had written. They said no one could make that shot. But impossible is just a word people use when they cannot see the solution. I saw it. I made it. And 23 men went home to their families because I refused to accept what they told me could not be done. Kira closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. Her grandfather had died without recognition, his records buried, his achievements forgotten. She had made a promise at his funeral, standing beside a grave marked only with his name and dates. She would not let his legacy disappear. She would prove that the O'Yelleran gift was real, that the impossible shots could be made, that the people who dismissed them were wrong. Midnight found her at the range. She had not asked permission. She had simply taken her rifle from the armory using the access code she had memorized during her earlier visit and made her way through the darkness to Lane 7. She was not shooting. She was listening. Her grandfather's journal described a technique he called reading the wind conversation. Most snipers measured wind speed and direction, calculated adjustments, and hoped for the best. Isaiah O'Yelleran had taught himself to hear the wind as a living thing, to understand its patterns and predict its movements before they happened. Kira stood in the darkness with her eyes closed, feeling the Afghan air move against her skin. The wind here was different from anywhere she had trained. It came off the mountains in waves, shifting direction without warning, carrying dust and cold and the smell of distant snow. Learning its language would take time. but she had learned harder languages before. A footstep behind her made her turn, rifle coming up instinctively before she recognized the silhouette. Fuentes stood at the edge of the range, his hands visible and empty in the dim light. "Easy," he said. "Just came to see who was crazy enough to be out here at midnight." Kira lowered her weapon. Could not sleep. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. Looked at the empty lane in front of her. "You're not shooting." "No." "Then what are you doing?" "Listening." He was quiet for a moment, considering this. "That IED you spotted yesterday, during the patrol briefing. You saw something in the photographs that 3 trained Marines missed." Kira had not realized anyone noticed. "I saw disturbed earth patterns. Signs of recent digging." Crenshaw said it was a lucky guess. Crenshaw sees what he wants to see. Fuentes almost smiled. He moved to stand beside her, looking out at the darkness beyond the range. "You know they're never going to give you a fair shot here. Not with Gunny running things. Not after what happened to his brother." Kira did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the mountains, on the places where the wind was born. "Then I'll take an unfair one." The patrol briefing happened at 0700 in the Tactical Operations Center. Kira stood at the back of the room while Crenshaw outlined the mission. A routine sweep of the valley floor, checking on local villages and gathering intelligence about enemy movement in the area. 8 Marines plus 1 observer. He said the word observer while looking directly at her. "O'Yelleran, you will accompany the patrol for evaluation purposes. You will carry your weapon, but you will not engage unless directly threatened. Your role is to watch and learn." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Try not to get in the way." The patrol moved out 30 minutes later. Kira took position in the middle of the formation, surrounded by Marines who treated her like she was carrying a contagious disease. No one spoke to her. No one acknowledged her presence. She was a ghost walking among men who refused to see her. The valley floor was a maze of irrigation ditches and low stone walls, with scattered compounds that could hide anything from friendly farmers to enemy fighters. Kira's eyes moved constantly, scanning the terrain the way her grandfather had taught her. Not just looking for threats, but reading the landscape itself. The way dust settled, the patterns of footprints, the subtle signs that most people never learn to see. They were 2 kilometers from the FOB when she noticed it. The path ahead curved around a large boulder, funneling foot traffic into a narrow gap between rocks. It was a natural choke point, the kind of place that made snipers nervous and bomb makers excited. But that was not what caught her attention. What caught her attention was the dirt. The soil on the path had been disturbed recently, not by footsteps or weather, but by digging. Someone had excavated a section of the trail and then carefully replaced the earth, packing it down to look natural. They had done a good job. Most people would never notice the slight color variation, the too smooth surface, the absence of the small stones that littered every other inch of the path. Kira was not most people. "Hold," she called out, her voice cutting through the silence. The point man, a lance corporal named Briggs, turned to look at her with irritation. "What?" "Stop moving." Everyone stop. Crenshaw pushed through the formation, his face dark with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing, O'Yelleran? You do not give orders on my patrol." "There's an IED," Kira said. She pointed at the disturbed earth 20 meters ahead. "Right there. The soil has been excavated and replaced. Look at the color variation. Look at the surface texture." Crenshaw squinted at the path. "I do not see anything." Kira stepped forward, moving past the other Marines until she was at the front of the formation. Briggs was 3 steps from the kill zone. She grabbed his arm and pulled him back, physically stopping him from walking any further. "Hey," Briggs protested. "Get your hands off me." "Look at the ground," Kira said. "Really look." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Fuentes, who had been watching from his position in the middle of the formation, stepped forward and knelt beside the path. He studied the earth for several seconds before looking up at Crenshaw. "She's right, Gunny. Something is buried here." The EOD team arrived 40 minutes later. They confirmed the presence of a pressure plate IED buried 6 inches beneath the surface, packed with enough explosive to kill everyone within 15 meters. The controlled detonation sent a column of dirt and smoke into the Afghan sky and left a crater where Briggs would have been standing. Kira watched the explosion from a safe distance, feeling nothing but the familiar emptiness that came after a close call. She had saved lives today. She had proven that her training meant something, and she already knew that none of it would matter to the men around her. Crenshaw approached her as the patrol prepared to continue. His face was unreadable. "Lucky guess," he said. "Or maybe you've been reading their playbook." The accusation hung in the air between them. Kira understood what he was implying, that she had known about the IED because she was working with the enemy, that her so-called skill was actually betrayal. "I spotted disturbed Earth," she said, keeping her voice level. "That is what I was trained to do." Crenshaw leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "I do not know what Game SEAL Command is playing by sending you here, but I'm going to find out. And when I do, you will wish you had stayed wherever they found you." He walked away before she could respond. Not that she would have. Some accusations did not deserve the dignity of a defense. The return to the FOB was silent. The Marines who had witnessed her save Briggs's life did not thank her, did not acknowledge what had happened. They simply walked back through the valley with their eyes forward and their mouths shut, as if the IED and the explosion and the crater in the path were things that had happened to someone else. Maddox caught up with her near the motor pool. The young corporal's face was twisted with something that might have been confusion or anger or both. "That thing back there," he said. "How did you really know?" Kira stopped walking. "I told you. Disturbed Earth patterns. Nobody sees that stuff. Nobody." "I do." He shook his head, unwilling or unable to accept the explanation. "You're hiding something. Gunny is right about you. There is something wrong with this whole situation." Kira looked at him for a long moment. Maddox was young, barely old enough to buy a beer back home. He had probably grown up in a small town where women knew their place and strangers were automatically suspect. He was not evil. He was just limited. Believe whatever you need to believe, Corporal, but that IED was real. And if I had not spotted it, you would be writing letters to Briggs's family right now. She walked away before he could respond. That night, Lieutenant Commander Brandt found her in her quarters. He was her SEAL chain of command, the officer responsible for her assignment and evaluation. He was also the only person on this base who seemed to understand what she was facing. "I heard about the patrol," he said, standing in her doorway. "Good work on the IED. Crenshaw thinks I'm a spy." Brandt sighed. "Crenshaw thinks anyone who challenges his worldview is a threat. I have seen his type before. Can you do anything? I can file reports. I can document his behavior. But if I intervene directly, it undermines your credibility." He met her eyes. "You need to handle this yourself, O'Yellerin. You need to prove yourself so thoroughly that even Crenshaw cannot deny what you are capable of." After he left, Kira sat on her cot, and Field stripped her rifle. She reassembled it. Then she stripped it again, and again, and again, 17 times, her fingers moving through the familiar motions while her mind processed the day. The IED, the accusation, the silence of the men she had saved. She was on the 18th disassembly when the alarm klaxon shattered the night. "All hands to the TOC. Emergency briefing. All hands to the TOC." Kira reassembled her rifle in 12 seconds and ran toward the Tactical Operations Center. The room was already packed when she arrived. Marines and support personnel crowding around the central table where Crenshaw stood with a grim expression. "We have a situation," the gunnery sergeant announced. "Enemy sniper activity in the valley. 3 Afghan National Army soldiers killed in the last 48 hours. Intel says he is operating from the high ground to our east." He pulled up a map on the screen. "They're calling him the Wraith. Nobody has seen him. Nobody has survived an encounter with him." A murmur ran through the assembled personnel. Kira studied the map, noting the terrain features, the elevation changes, the likely sniper positions. "I am putting together a hunting party," Crenshaw continued. "We leave at first light tomorrow." He scanned the room until his eyes found Kira. "This is real work, O'Yellerin. Requires experienced shooters." He smiled without warmth. "You stay on base." The hunting party returned at dusk, and Kira knew from their faces that something had gone wrong. The Marines walked through the FOB gates with the hollow look of men who had been outmatched, their weapons hanging loose and their eyes avoiding contact with anyone who might ask questions. Crenshaw was the last through the gate. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his hand was shaking with what might have been rage or fear or both. Behind him, two Marines supported a third between them. The wounded man had a bandage wrapped around his head, blood seeping through the white gauze. Kira watched from outside her quarters as the medical team rushed forward. She caught fragments of conversation as the wounded Marine was carried toward the aid station. "Closest miss I have ever seen. Quarter-inch higher and it would have taken his head off. Never even saw where the shot came from." The Wraith had drawn first blood. That night, the atmosphere in the FOB changed. The easy confidence that Marines carried like a second uniform had been replaced by something darker. Men spoke in quieter voices. Eyes lingered on the mountains longer than necessary. Everyone knew that somewhere out there, an enemy sniper was watching them, waiting for his next opportunity. Crenshaw called an emergency briefing in the TOC. His voice was steady, but Kira could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. "The target is more skilled than initial intelligence suggested," he admitted. "He is using terrain features we did not anticipate. We will adjust our approach and try again tomorrow." "What approach?" someone asked from the back of the room. Crenshaw's eyes found the speaker and turned cold. "The approach I decide on. Any other questions?" Silence. Dismissed. Kira was leaving the TOC when Crenshaw caught her arm. His grip was harder than necessary, his fingers digging into her bicep with barely controlled force. "You think this is funny," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You think because we did not find him that it proves something about you." "I did not think anything, Gunnery Sergeant. I was not there." "No, you were not." He released her arm and stepped back. "But I see that look in your eyes. The one that says you think you could do better." His face twisted into something ugly. "You cannot. You are not good enough. You never will be." He walked away before she could respond. Kira stood in the darkness outside the TOC, rubbing her arm where his fingers had left marks, and wondered how much longer she could maintain her composure. The helicopter arrived the next morning. Kira was at the range, practicing with the repaired scope, when the roar of rotors announced an unexpected arrival. She watched a single figure step off the aircraft, a man in civilian clothes who moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades in places like this. Master Chief Solomon Vickers was a legend in the special operations community. 30 years as a SEAL, 15 of them as a sniper, with a classified record that supposedly included shots so difficult they had been studied by ballistics experts around the world. He had retired 5 years ago and now worked as a contractor, advising units in active combat zones on the finer points of precision marksmanship. Kira had heard of him. Every SEAL sniper had heard of him, but she had never expected to meet him here, in this forgotten outpost where her career was slowly being strangled by men who refused to see her value. Vickers found her at the range an hour later. He stood at the edge of her lane and watched her shoot for several minutes without speaking. Kira was aware of his presence, but did not acknowledge it. She simply continued her routine, placing rounds downrange with the methodical precision that had earned her a place in the SEAL sniper program. Where she finally paused to reload, Vickers spoke. "O'Yelleran." His voice was deep and weathered, like gravel being poured over leather. "Your grandfather was Isaiah O'Yelleran." Kira turned to look at him for the first time. "You knew him." "I knew of him." Vickers walked closer, his eyes studying her face as if looking for something specific. "I spent 3 years trying to track down his service records after I heard stories about what he could do. Central Highlands, 1968. A shot that should have been impossible." He found what he was looking for in her expression. "You have his eyes." Kira felt something shift inside her chest. In all her years of training, of proving herself, of fighting for every inch of recognition, no one had ever acknowledged her grandfather's legacy. No one had ever known who he was or what he had accomplished. Until now. "He was the greatest sniper I have ever known," she said quietly. Vickers nodded, and they buried him. Buried his records, his achievements, everything. Because the men in charge could not accept what a black man from Montana could do with a rifle. He paused, sound familiar? Kira said nothing. She did not need to. I read your training scores before I came here, Vickers continued. Classified or not, I have access to things most people do not. What I saw was exceptional. What I want to know is whether you can do it under pressure. When people are counting on you. When there is no second chance. Give me the opportunity, and I will show you. Vickers smiled for the first time. That is exactly what your grandfather would have said. He gestured toward the range. Show me the wind reading technique. The one he developed. For the next 3 hours, Kira demonstrated everything her grandfather had taught her. The way to feel air currents through exposed skin. The patterns that wind created in dust and vegetation. The subtle signs that indicated shifts before they happened. Vickers watched without interruption, his expression unreadable, until she finished with a sequence of 5 shots at 800 meters that grouped within a 2-inch circle despite a swirling crosswind. When she lowered her rifle, Vickers was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made her throat tighten. Your grandfather would be proud. That evening, word spread through the FOB that the legendary Master Chief Vickers had been seen working with a female SEAL sniper. Kira noticed the sidelong glances, the whispered conversations, the slight shift in how some of the Marines looked at her. Not respect, not yet, but something close to uncertainty. The possibility, however faint, that they might have been wrong about her. But Crenshaw's hostility only intensified. He cornered her outside the chow hall, his face flushed with anger. Vickers is a contractor. He does not run operations here. Whatever he thinks he saw at the range does not change anything. I did not say it did, Gunnery Sergeant. Good, because the Wraith is still out there. And when we take him down, it will be my team that does it. Not some SEAL princess with a famous grandfather. He stormed away before she could respond. Kira watched him go, feeling the weight of his hatred like a physical pressure against her chest. Somewhere in the mountains, the Wraith was waiting. And tomorrow, Crenshaw would try again to find him. The night raid happened without warning. 0200, Kira was jolted awake by the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley. She grabbed her rifle and ran toward the TOC, where chaos had already erupted. Radio traffic filled the room with desperate voices. Contact, contact, contact. Multiple enemy positions. We are pinned down. Request immediate support. Crenshaw's hunting party had walked into an ambush. The Wraith had been waiting for them. Kira moved toward the door, her rifle in her hands, her body already shifting into combat mode. She was 3 steps from the exit when Lieutenant Commander Brandt blocked her path. Stand down, O'Yellerin. Sir, they need sniper support. I can help. If you go out there without authorization, they will court-martial you. He grabbed her shoulder, holding her in place. This is not your fight. Not yet. From the radio behind them came the sound of screaming, gunfire, and a voice calling for help that might never arrive. Kira did not go. She stood in the TOC with her rifle in her hands and listened to the radio traffic until the extraction was complete. 2 more Marines wounded. 1 critically. The hunting party limped back to the FOB at 0400 with defeat written on their faces and blood on their uniforms. She watched them come through the gate from the shadows outside her quarters. Watched the medics rush forward. Watched Crenshaw's shoulders sag under the weight of another failure. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Then he saw her standing there, and his expression hardened into something toxic. This is your fault, he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. If SEAL Command had not saddled us with a babysitting mission, we would have had the resources to do this right. Kira said nothing. There was nothing to say. Crenshaw needed someone to blame, and she was the most convenient target. The fact that she had not been anywhere near the ambush did not matter. The fact that she had wanted to help and been forbidden did not matter. In his mind, her presence alone was enough to cause disaster. The crowd dispersed. The wounded were carried to the aid station, and Kira returned to her quarters, where she finally allowed herself to break. The tears came first, hot and angry, streaming down her face as she pressed her fist against her mouth to muffle the sounds. She had not cried since her grandfather's funeral, had not allowed herself that weakness. But something about tonight about standing helpless while men died and then being blamed for it, cracked the armor she had spent years building. She threw her rifle case against the wall. The impact felt good, so she did it again and again, until her arms ached and her throat was raw and the rage had burned itself out, leaving only emptiness behind. The journal was where she had left it, on the footlocker beside her cot. Kira picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to the final entry. Her grandfather had written these words 3 days before he died, his handwriting shaky but still legible. They will always find reasons to say you cannot. The color of your skin, the place you came from, the way you speak or pray or love. They will build walls from their fear and call them facts. Do not waste your life trying to tear those walls down. Make the shot anyway. Let the bullet speak for you. Let the results be your answer. And when you are gone, let someone else carry the rifle forward. Kira pressed the journal against her chest and wept. For her grandfather, for herself, for the impossible situation she had walked into and the impossible choice she faced. She could request a transfer, walk away from this place and these people who refused to see her. Or she could stay, keep fighting, keep proving herself to men who might never acknowledge the truth. A knock at the door interrupted her grief. She wiped her face quickly, straightened her uniform, and opened it to find Vickers standing in the darkness. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice was gentle in a way she had not heard before. She stepped aside to let him enter. He glanced at the dented rifle case, the tears she had not quite managed to hide, and said nothing about either. "I heard what Crenshaw said," Vickers told her. "It was wrong. You know that. Knowing does not change anything." "No, it does not." He sat on the edge of her cot, uninvited, but somehow not unwelcome. "I was doubted too when I started. Not for the same reasons. But I know what it feels like to have men look at you and see something other than what you are. What did you do?" "I gave them undeniable truth." He met her eyes. That is the only thing that changes minds. Not arguments. Not appeals to fairness. Results. You have to be so good that they cannot pretend otherwise. You have to make them see. Kira thought about her grandfather's words. Make the shot anyway. Let the bullet speak for you. The same advice delivered across generations. The same impossible task. "The Wraith," she said. "If I could take him down." Vickers nodded slowly. That would be undeniable. The intel briefing happened the next afternoon. A contractor from military intelligence had arrived on the morning helicopter, carrying classified reports about the enemy sniper who had terrorized the valley for the past 2 weeks. Kira sat in the back of the TOC and listened to statistics that made her blood run cold. 12 confirmed kills. Afghan National Army, local police, 1 American contractor. All from extreme range, all with single shots, all without any visual contact reported by survivors. The Wraith operated from the high ground east of the FOB, using the terrain features of the spine to appear and disappear like smoke. His pattern, the intel contractor explained, is consistent. He never takes a shot under 1,200 meters, never uses the same position twice. He appears to be highly trained, possibly foreign, with equipment and skills that suggest professional military background. Crenshaw spoke up from the front of the room. "We have tried 3 times to locate him. He knows we are coming before we get close." "Because you're approaching from predictable angles," Kira said before she could stop herself. Every head in the room turned toward her. Crenshaw's face flushed with anger. "Excuse me." Kira stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "The spine has limited observation points. He knows which routes you will use, because there are only a few that make tactical sense. He is not outmaneuvering you. He is predicting you." The silence stretched for several seconds. Then the intel contractor nodded slowly. "She is right. Analysis of his shot patterns suggests he has mapped the likely approach vectors and positioned himself accordingly." Crenshaw looked like he wanted to throw something. "This briefing is over. We will discuss approach options among senior personnel." The room emptied slowly. Kira was one of the last to leave, and she found Fuentes waiting for her outside. "That IED," he said without preamble. "The one you spotted on patrol. That was not luck." "No, it was not." He studied her face for a moment, then glanced around to make sure they were alone. Well, I said the other night about Gunny's brother. There is more to that story than he tells. Kira Witzit. Tyler Crenshaw died in Helmand Province. There was a female intelligence officer attached to the operation. She made a call that Gunny disagreed with. Things went wrong. Tyler did not make it out. Fuentes boast, but I talked to a guy who was there. He said the intel officer's call was the right one. That Tyler died because he ignored her warning and went in anyway. Gunny does not see it that way. He never will. So he blames all women for what happened to his brother. He blames anyone who reminds him that his brother might have been wrong. Fuentes met her eyes. I am not saying it is fair. I am saying I understand it now. And I do not think you deserve what he is doing to you. Before Kira could respond, the alarm klaxon shattered the afternoon silence. All hands to the TOC. Emergency. All hands to the TOC. They ran together toward the Tactical Operations Center. The room was already filled with grim faces when they arrived. On the main screen, a live feed from a surveillance drone showed the village of Darwan, 3 kilometers from the FOB. Medical personnel had been conducting a humanitarian visit. Children receiving vaccinations. Families collecting supplies. In the center of the frame, a Marine medic lay motionless on the ground. A small figure, a child, crouched beside him, screaming. The Wraith had struck again, this time in broad daylight, this time in front of everyone. And the message was clear. He was untouchable, and he wanted them to know it. The emergency briefing convened within the hour. Every senior officer and NCO on the FOB crowded into the Tactical Operations Center, their faces grim with the knowledge that the Wraith had just escalated the conflict to a level none of them had anticipated. The Marine medic was in surgery. The child he had been treating was unharmed but traumatized. And somewhere in the mountains, an enemy sniper was waiting for his next opportunity. The commanding officer, a Marine colonel named Harwood who had arrived 2 days earlier for a scheduled inspection, stood at the head of the table. His presence changed the dynamic in the room. Crenshaw was no longer the highest authority. He was just another subordinate waiting for orders. We have a humanitarian mission scheduled for 48 hours from now, Colonel Harwood announced. Medical outreach to 3 villages in the valley. Vaccination programs, supply distribution, relationship building with local leadership. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. That mission cannot be canceled. The political implications would set our efforts back by months. Sir, Crenshaw spoke up. With the Wraith still operational, sending personnel into the valley is suicide, which is why the Wraith must be eliminated before the mission proceeds. Harwood's eyes swept the room. I want options. Now. Crenshaw stepped forward, his confidence partially restored by the opportunity to present a plan. Night infiltration to the spine. We approach from the northern ridge under cover of darkness, establish observation posts before dawn, and wait for him to reveal his position. Vickers, who had been standing quietly in the corner, spoke without raising his voice. That approach has failed 3 times already. Crenshaw's jaw tightened. We will adjust our vectors. He has already mapped your vectors. He knows how you think. Vickers did not look at Crenshaw as he spoke. He was watching Kira. You need a different approach entirely. Colonel Harwood Froned. What are you suggesting, Master Chief? I am suggesting you listen to someone who has been studying this problem from a different angle. Vickers nodded toward Kira. Petty Officer O'Yelleran has developed an analysis that contradicts our current assumptions. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Kira felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, the skepticism and hostility radiating from men who had spent days dismissing her existence. But she also felt something else. The opportunity her grandfather had written about. The chance to let her work speak for itself. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. The Wraith is not operating randomly. He is following a precise psychological pattern designed to maximize fear while minimizing his own exposure. She moved to the tactical display and began pulling up the data she had compiled over the past several days. Every shot he has taken, every position he has used, follows a logic that becomes clear when you map it against terrain features and sight lines. Crenshaw snorted. You have been here less than a week. You have not even been outside the wire except once. I have been studying the intelligence reports, the shot trajectories, the timing of his attacks. Kira brought up a map overlay she had created during the sleepless nights when anger and frustration had driven her to find some way to contribute. He never shoots from the same position twice, but his positions are not random. They form a pattern based on optimal observation angles to high-value targets. She highlighted a series of points on the map. Each position gives him overlapping fields of fire to locations we care about. The FOB gates, the helicopter landing zone, the main road to the villages. He is not just killing people. He is demonstrating that he can kill anyone, anywhere, whenever he chooses. Colonel Harwood leaned forward, studying the map with new interest. Go on. Based on his pattern, I can predict his most likely positions for the next 48 hours. Kira highlighted 3 locations on the spine. These give him optimal angles to the humanitarian convoy route. If we establish counter-sniper positions before he moves into place, we can catch him transitioning between hides. And you expect us to trust your analysis over experienced Marine snipers? Crenshaw demanded. Vickers spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Her analysis matches classified intelligence assessments that arrived this morning. He looked at Colonel Harwood, assessments that none of us have seen yet because they were sent directly to me. The room went silent. Kira felt something shift in the atmosphere, a recalibration of assumptions that had seemed unshakable moments before. SEAL Command did not send Petty Officer O'Yelleran here randomly, Vickers continued. They sent her because she is the best long-range precision shooter they have. Her training scores are classified because they broke records that the Navy does not want publicized. He turned to look directly at Crenshaw. She is not here to be evaluated. She is here because Command believed she was the only shooter capable of dealing with a threat exactly like the Wraith. Crenshaw's face went pale, then red, then pale again. That is impossible. No one told me. No one was required to tell you. Vickers did not blink. Your job was to integrate her into operations. Instead, you sidelined her based on personal prejudice. Colonel Harwood raised a hand, cutting off the argument before it could escalate. Enough. He studied the map for a long moment, then looked at Kira. You believe you can locate this sniper? Yes, sir. And engage him if necessary. Kira thought about her grandfather's journal, about the shot he had made in Vietnam, about the legacy she carried and the promise she had made at his grave. Yes, sir. Harwood nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, daylight observation mission. Petty Officer O'Yelleran will attempt to locate the Wraith using her analysis. He looked at Crenshaw. Gunnery Sergeant, you will provide support personnel and ensure she has everything she needs. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Crenshaw looked like he wanted to argue, to protest, to do anything except follow an order that put his fate in the hands of a woman he had spent days trying to destroy. But he was a Marine, and Marines followed orders. Yes, sir, he said through clenched teeth. The briefing ended. Personnel filed out of the TOC in stunned silence. Kira remained at the tactical display, studying the position she had identified, running calculations in her head. She did not notice Vickers' approach until he spoke. You ready for this? She looked at him. I have been ready my entire life. The observation mission launched at 0600 the next morning. Kira established her position at a hide site overlooking the valley, her rifle resting on a bipod as she scanned the spine through her scope. For 3 hours she watched and waited, reading the wind, studying the terrain, searching for any sign of movement. She found him at 0917, a glint of light, a shadow that did not match the rock formation behind it, a shape that resolved, as she adjusted her magnification, into the outline of a man lying prone on a ledge 1,800 meters away. The Wraith. Kira's breath caught in her throat. She keyed her radio to report the contact, her finger already moving toward the trigger. Then the Wraith moved. He shifted position, turning his rifle until it was pointed directly at her hide site. Through her scope, Kira saw him raise one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. He had known she was there. He had known the entire time. Before she could react, he disappeared. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, melting into the rocks like smoke in the wind. Kira lowered her rifle, her hands trembling for the first time since she had arrived at FOB Copperhead. The distance between them had been 1,847 meters. 3 wind zones. An impossible shot. And now the Wraith knew exactly who she was. Kira returned to the FOB with her hands steady and her face composed, but inside she felt something she had not experienced since the first day of SEAL training. Fear, not of the Wraith himself, but of what his wave had meant. He had seen her, studied her, chosen not to kill her when he easily could have. He was playing a game, and she did not yet understand the rules. The debriefing happened in the TOC with Colonel Harwood, Crenshaw, Vickers, and a handful of senior personnel. Kira reported everything. The position she had identified, the confirmation of her analysis, the moment of contact, and the wave. "Let me understand this," Crenshaw said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You had eyes on the target. You had a rifle in your hands, and you did not take the shot." The distance was 1,847 meters. Kira kept her voice level. 3 distinct wind zones between my position and his. No clear lane through the rock formations. Even if I had fired, the probability of a hit was less than 5%. "So you choked." I made a tactical assessment. "There's a difference." Colonel Harwood held up a hand before Crenshaw could respond. 1,800 meters with multiple wind zones. He looked around the room. "Is there anyone here who could make that shot?" Silence. Even Crenshaw, for all his hostility, did not claim the capability. Vickers spoke quietly. "I have seen maybe 3 shooters in my career who could attempt it. 2 of them are dead." He looked at Kira. "The third is standing in this room." The briefing ended without resolution. The Wraith had been located but not eliminated. The humanitarian mission was still scheduled for the following morning. And somewhere in the mountains, an enemy sniper was waiting to see what would happen next. They found out 6 hours later. The Afghan National Police officer was discovered at the edge of the village of Darwan, his body positioned carefully against a wall where it would be visible from the road. A single bullet wound to the chest. Clean, precise, professional. But it was not the killing that sent a chill through the FOB. It was the note, written in English, pinned to the dead man's uniform, were 8 words that changed everything. "Send the woman. I want a real challenge." Colonel Harwood read the note aloud in the emergency briefing that followed. The room was silent when he finished. Every eye turned toward Kira, some with hostility, some with fear, some with something that might have been grudging respect. "He knows who you are," Harwood said. "He is calling you out specifically." Kira nodded. "He wants to prove he is better. Or he wants to draw you into a trap," Crenshaw countered. "Both things can be true." Kira met the gunnery sergeant's eyes. "He is confident, arrogant. He believes he can beat me in a straight contest. That arrogance is a weakness I can exploit." Harwood studied her for a long moment. "The humanitarian mission proceeds as scheduled. Petty Officer O'Yelleran, you will provide overwatch from the primary observation position. Your orders are to locate and eliminate the Wraith before he can threaten the convoy or the village." "Understood, sir." The night before the mission, Kira could not sleep. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling, running calculations in her head. Wind speeds, distances, angles, the geometry of the impossible shot that stood between her and a man who wanted to kill her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Fuentes standing in the darkness, his expression serious. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. He entered and stood awkwardly in the center of the small room, as if unsure how to begin. "The men are scared," he said finally. "Not just of the Wraith. They are scared of what happens if you fail tomorrow." Kira said nothing. She knew what he meant. If you miss that shot, if something goes wrong, they will say it proves what they already believe. That women do not belong in combat roles. That you were a mistake. Fuentes met her eyes. "Every woman who comes after you will have to fight twice as hard because of what happens tomorrow." The weight of his words settled over her like a physical burden. She had known, intellectually, that she carried more than her own reputation. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way it had not been before. "I did not ask for that responsibility," she said quietly. No, but you have it anyway. He paused. For what it is worth, I think you can do it. I have watched you shoot. I have seen how you think. You are better than anyone else on this base, including Gunny, even if you will never admit it. Why are you telling me this? Because whatever happens tomorrow, I have got your back. Fuentes extended his hand. I should have said that days ago. I was wrong to wait. Kira took his hand and shook it. Thank you. After he left, she sat on her cot and opened her grandfather's journal. She had read every page dozens of times, but tonight she was looking for something specific, a passage she had never fully understood until now. She found it near the middle of the book. Her grandfather's cramped handwriting describing a shot he had made in 1968. The Central Highlands, a distance of over 1,700 meters. 3 wind zones that shifted without warning, and an 18-inch gap between 2 rock formations that the bullet needed to thread in order to reach the enemy sniper who had pinned down his patrol. They told me it was impossible, he had written. The gap was too narrow. The wind was too unpredictable. The distance was too great. But I closed my eyes and listened to the wind, and it told me what to do. The wind is not your enemy. It is a conversation. You speak with your calculations. It answers with its movements. And when you understand each other, the shot becomes possible. Kira stared at the words until they blurred. Her grandfather had faced the same shot, the same impossible geometry, and he had made it, saving 23 lives in a war that had tried to erase his contribution. She went to the range at midnight. Vickers was waiting for her, as if he had known she would come. The wind conversation, he said without preamble. Your grandfather's technique. You know about it. I have spent years trying to understand it. He gestured toward the darkness beyond the range. Most snipers fight the wind. They calculate adjustments and hope for the best. Your grandfather learned to work with it, to predict its movements before they happened. How? Close your eyes. Vickers moved to stand beside her. Feel the air on your skin. Not just the direction, not just the speed. Feel the rhythm. The wind has patterns like breathing. Once you learn to feel those patterns, you can anticipate the changes. Kira closed her eyes. The Afghan night air moved against her face, cool and dry, carrying the scent of dust and distant snow. She focused on the sensation, trying to feel what her grandfather had described. The rhythm, the breathing, the conversation. For a long time, she felt nothing but wind. Then, slowly something shifted. A pattern emerged from the chaos. A rhythm that rose and fell like the chest of a sleeping giant. I feel it, she whispered. Good. Vickers placed a hand on her shoulder. Now remember that feeling. Tomorrow, when you're looking at an impossible shot, that feeling is what will make it possible. 0400 came too quickly. Kira gathered her gear in the pre-dawn darkness, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment. Her rifle, her scope, her ammunition, the journal, tucked into a pocket close to her heart. The humanitarian convoy was assembling near the main gate. Medical personnel, supplies, marine security, and somewhere in the mountains, the Wraith was taking his position, preparing for the contest he had demanded. Kira walked to the observation post they called the Overlook. The position gave her a clear view of the valley, the village, and the spine. She settled in her hide, pressed her eye to the scope, and began to scan. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red. The convoy started moving toward the village, and Kira waited, her finger resting beside the trigger, for the enemy who had promised her a real challenge. The humanitarian convoy reached the village of Darwan at 0730. Kira watched through her scope as the vehicles stopped in the central square, as Marines established a security perimeter, as medical personnel began setting up their stations. Children emerged from doorways, curious and cautious. Women in colorful headscarves gathered near the supply trucks. The village came alive with the kind of hopeful activity that made the war feel almost worthwhile. And somewhere in the mountains, the Wraith was watching too. Kira scanned the spine methodically, her eye moving across the rock formation she had identified as high-probability positions. Nothing. No movement. No glint of glass or metal. No shadow that did not belong. The enemy sniper had gone aground, and she could not find him. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the valley into a furnace of reflected heat. Sweat dripped down Kira's face and pooled beneath her body armor, but she did not move, did not blink, did not allow her attention to waver for even a moment. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from the convoy. Medical treatment proceeding. Supplies distributed. Local leadership engaged. Everything was going according to plan, which meant something was about to go wrong. Midday arrived with a shimmering heat haze that made distance shooting nearly impossible. Through her scope, Kira could see children playing near the medical station, their laughter carrying faintly across the valley. Mothers held infants while doctors administered vaccinations. Marines stood guard with weapons ready, their eyes scanning the hills for threats they could not see. At 12:17, Kira spotted the glint. It came from a position on the spine, exactly where her analysis had predicted. A flash of reflected light that lasted less than a second before disappearing. She adjusted her scope, focusing on the location, searching for confirmation. There, a shape that might have been a rifle barrel, a shadow that might have been a human form. She keyed her radio. Overlooked to convoy. Possible contact on the spine. Grid reference follows. She was reciting the coordinates when something made her stop. The glint had been too perfect, too obvious. In all her observations of the Wraith, he had never made a mistake like that. He was too skilled, too careful, too aware of counter-sniper protocols. Unless he wanted to be seen. Kira shifted her scope away from the obvious position and began scanning the surrounding terrain. If the Wraith had placed a decoy, he would be somewhere else. Somewhere that gave him a shot at the convoy, while her attention was focused on the wrong location. She traced the sight lines from the village, calculating angles and distances. The spine was the obvious choice for a sniper position. Everyone expected the threat to come from there. But there was another ridge south of the village that offered a different advantage. Closer range, better angle on the security perimeter, and a clear shot at the medical station where the children were gathered. Overlooked to convoy. Kira's voice was urgent now. That contact on the spine is a decoy. Repeat, decoy. The shooter has repositioned to the south ridge. Crenshaw's voice came back immediately, dripping with skepticism. You are seeing ghosts, O'Yellerin. Stay focused on your assigned sector. Negative. I am repositioning to acquire the real target. She did not wait for permission. She was already moving, breaking down her position and sprinting toward a secondary hide site that would give her eyes on the south ridge. Crenshaw's voice erupted from her radio, furious and demanding. Get back to your assigned position. That is a direct order. Kira ignored him. She could feel the truth of her analysis in her bones, the same instinct that had spotted the IED on her first patrol. The Wraith was not on the spine. He was somewhere else, and if she did not find him in the next few minutes, people were going to die. She reached the secondary position and threw herself down behind a rocky outcrop. Her hands moved automatically, setting up her rifle, adjusting her scope, acquiring the south ridge. For 3 agonizing seconds, she saw nothing. Then she found him. The Wraith had concealed himself in a natural depression between 2 boulders, his body wrapped in a ghillie suit that blended perfectly with the surrounding rocks. He was prone, his rifle extended, his eye pressed to his scope, and his barrel was pointed directly at the village. Kira opened her mouth to call the warning. The Wraith fired first. The crack of the shot echoed across the valley, followed immediately by screaming from the convoy. Through her scope, Kira saw a Marine spin and fall, clutching his shoulder. Not fatal. Not yet. But the security perimeter was collapsing as men dove for cover, as civilians scattered in panic, as the careful order of the humanitarian mission dissolved into chaos. Contact, contact, contact. The radio exploded with voices. Sniper fire from the south. 1 casualty. We are pinned down. Kira blocked out the noise. Blocked out the screaming and the gunfire and the desperate calls for support. There was only the target now. Only the shot. She acquired the Wraith in her scope. He was already shifting position, preparing for his second shot. The distance between them was exactly what she had calculated. 1,847 meters. Over a mile of Afghan mountain air filled with three distinct wind patterns that would bend any bullet into uselessness. And between her position and his, rising from the rocks like ancient sentinels, two stone formations created a gap barely 18 inches wide. The only clear lane to the target. The impossible geometry her grandfather had faced 50 years ago in a different war. Kira pressed her eye to the scope and felt the world narrow to a single point of focus. The wraith, the gap, the wind. She could hear Crenshaw shouting on the radio, demanding to know her position. She could hear the wounded Marine screaming for a medic. She could hear the children crying in the village below. None of it mattered. There was only the shot. She began her calculations. Wind speed at her position, 8 miles per hour from the northwest. Wind speed at the midpoint, estimated 12 miles per hour with a clockwise rotation. Wind speed at the target, unknown but likely shifting. The three zones created a curved trajectory that no standard ballistic calculation could account for. But Kira was not using standard calculations. She was using her grandfather's technique. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and felt the wind against her skin. The rhythm Vickers had taught her to recognize. The conversation her grandfather had described in his journal. The air was speaking, telling her things that instruments could not measure. When she opened her eyes, she knew exactly what adjustment to make. Her finger moved to the trigger. The wraith was settling into his new position, preparing to fire again. Through her scope, she could see as I pressed through his own optic, his crosshairs probably centered on another Marine. She had maybe 3 seconds before he pulled the trigger. The wind shifted. A gust came off the mountains, changing the pattern she had calculated. The impossible shot became even more impossible, and the wraith, perhaps sensing that he was being watched, began to move. Time slowed. Kira felt the world compress into a single point of absolute focus, everything beyond her scope fading into meaningless noise. This was the place her grandfather had written about, the space between heartbeats where a shooter stopped thinking and started knowing, where calculation became instinct, where the impossible became inevitable. The wind speaks, his journal had said. You listen, then you are not aiming anymore. You are conversing. She listened. The first wind zone swept across the ground in front of her position, gusting from left to right at approximately 8 miles per hour. She could feel it pushing against her cheek, taste the dust it carried. This layer would catch her bullet immediately after it left the barrel, shoving it off course before it had traveled 50 meters. The second zone existed in the middle distance, a swirling pocket of air created by the valley walls. Thermal currents rose from the sun-baked rocks and collided with cooler air descending from the peaks, creating a rotational pattern that changed direction every few seconds. Her grandfather had called this the chaos layer, the place where most shots died. The third zone waited near the target, high on the ridge where the wraith was preparing to fire again. The wind there pushed from right to left, the opposite of the first layer, with enough force to move a bullet several feet off target at this distance. 3 winds, 3 adjustments, 1 chance. Through her scope, Kira watched the wraith settle into his new position. His rifle swung toward the village, toward the medical station where children were hiding behind overturned tables. He was taking his time now, savoring the moment, confident that no one could touch him at this range. The radio crackled in her ear. Fuente's voice, tight with urgency. The wounded Marine is going into shock. We need to move him now, or we're going to lose him. Kira did not respond, could not respond. Every ounce of her consciousness was focused on the target and the impossible geometry between them. Then Crenshaw's voice cut through. O'Yelleran, take the shot or stand down. You have 3 seconds to decide. She did not need 3 seconds. Her finger found the trigger with the familiarity of 10,000 repetitions. Her breathing steadied into the pattern her instructors had drilled into her years ago. Inhale, exhale, pause at the bottom of the breath. Find a stillness between heartbeats. She made her final adjustments, compensated for the first wind zone by shifting her point of aim 2 feet to the left of the target. Added a vertical correction for the thermal lift in the chaos layer. Anticipated the third zone's push by adding another 18 inches of rightward offset. The calculations were insane. No ballistic computer would have approved them. No instructor would have taught them. They existed only in her grandfather's journal and in the instinct she had inherited from his blood. The 18-inch gap between the two rock formations filled her scope. Through that narrow window, she could see the Wraith's shoulder, his rifle, the side of his head. He was framed perfectly, as if the mountain itself had created a path for her bullet. She felt the wind shift one more time, felt the rhythm her grandfather had described, felt the conversation reach its final exchange, and she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The sound of the shot rolled across the valley like distant thunder, and the bullet began its impossible journey. 1.7 seconds. That was how long the round would travel before it reached the target. An eternity in combat. A lifetime of doubt and hope compressed into less than 2 heartbeats. Kira watched through her scope, tracking the vapor trail her bullet created as it punched through the first wind zone. She saw it curve left, exactly as she had calculated, bending away from the target as the ground-level wind pushed against it. Then it entered the chaos layer. For a fraction of a second, the bullet seemed to hang in the air, caught between competing forces that should have torn it apart. The swirling thermals grabbed it, twisted it, threatened to send it spinning into the rocks below. But her calculation held. Her adjustment for the rotation was precise. The bullet punched through the chaos and emerged on the other side, still tracking toward the target. The third wind zone hit it like a fist. The high-altitude current shoved the round to the right, adding velocity to its lateral drift. Any other bullet, fired by any other shooter, would have missed by a dozen feet. Kira's bullet threaded the 18-inch gap with inches to spare. Impact. Through her scope, she saw the Wraith jerk. His rifle fell from his hands, clattering down the rocks and disappearing into a crevice. His body slumped forward, then rolled, then came to rest against a boulder with the limp finality of death. For a long moment, there was only silence. The gunfire had stopped. The screaming had stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then Fuentes' voice exploded through the radio. Target down. I repeat, target down. The Wraith is down. Kira lowered her rifle. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She had done it. The impossible shot. The one they said could not be made. The one her grandfather had made 50 years ago in a different war on the other side of the world. She had done it. The convoy began moving again. Marines rushed to the wounded man, loading him onto a stretcher for evacuation. Medical personnel emerged from behind cover and resumed their work with shaking hands. Children crept out of hiding, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Kira stayed in her position, watching through her scope as the chaos resolved into order. The Wraith's body remained where it had fallen, a dark shape against the sunlit rocks. He had wanted a real challenge. He had gotten one. The radio crackled one more time. This time it was Crenshaw's voice, but something had changed. The mockery was gone. The contempt was gone. In its place was something Kira had never heard from him before. O'Yelleran. He paused, and she could hear him breathing. Report to the TOC immediately. She broke down her position and began the long walk back to the FOB. The sun was still high in the sky. The village was safe. The convoy would complete its mission. And somewhere, she knew, her grandfather was watching. The wind picked up as she walked, swirling dust around her boots in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. She thought about his journal, about the words he had written decades ago. Let the bullet speak for you. Let the results be your answer. She had spoken. She had answered. And now, finally, they would have to listen. The Tactical Operations Center was full when Kira arrived. Every Marine on the FOB seemed to have crowded into the room, standing shoulder to shoulder in a silence that felt different from anything she had experienced before. She saw Fuentes near the back, his face unreadable. She saw Maddox by the door, unable to meet her eyes. She saw the wounded Marine from the convoy, sitting in a chair with his shoulder bandaged, pale but alive. And she saw Crenshaw. The gunnery sergeant stood at the front of the room, his arms at his sides, his expression stripped of the hostility that had defined every interaction between them. He looked older somehow, smaller, like a man who had been forced to confront something he had spent years refusing to see. Kira stopped just inside the doorway. She did not know what to expect, did not know why she had been summoned here, to this room full of men who had dismissed and mocked and undermined her since the moment she arrived. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then Crenshaw spoke. That shot was 1,847 meters. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. 3 wind zones, an 18-inch gap between 2 rock formations that should have made it impossible. He paused, and Kira saw something in his eyes that might have been pain. I have been shooting for 20 years. I have trained some of the best snipers in the Marine Corps. I have made shots that other people called impossible. He shook his head slowly. I cannot have made that shot. No one I have ever trained could have made that shot. The room remained silent. Kira felt the weight of every eye on her, but she did not look away from Crenshaw. This moment had been earned with blood and patience, and a lifetime of being told she did not belong. Crenshaw stepped forward. His hand came up, extending toward her in a gesture that seemed to cost him everything. I was wrong about you, he said. From the first day you arrived, I was wrong. I let what happened to my brother blind me to what was right in front of my face. He kept his hand extended, waiting. I cannot take back what I said, what I did, but I can acknowledge the truth. You are the best shooter I have ever seen. And I am sorry. Kira looked at his hand. This was the man who had called her a liability, who had accused her of being a spy, who had tried to destroy her career because she reminded him of a wound that had never healed. Taking his hand would not erase any of that, would not make them friends, would not undo the damage, but it would be an acknowledgement, a recognition that something had changed. She took his hand. The grip was firm, brief, professional. Not forgiveness, not friendship, just the simple acknowledgement that they had reached an understanding built on undeniable truth. When she released his hand, the other Marines began to move. One by one, they stepped forward. Some offered handshakes. Some offered nods. Some simply met her eyes with expressions that said more than words ever could. The wall of hostility that had surrounded her since her arrival was crumbling, replaced by something that felt almost like respect. Fuentes reached her near the middle of the procession. His face split into a grin as he clasped her hand. Told you. Sometimes the best shot in a room is the one nobody sees coming. Kira allowed herself a small smile. Thank you. For everything. Do not thank me. You did the work. I just watched. Maddox was one of the last to approach. The young corporal who had told her to go play with dolls stood in front of her with his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on the floor. He opened his mouth twice before any words came out. What I said he finally managed. That first day. About the dolls. I did not. It was ignorant, Kira finished for him. Her voice was not harsh, but it was not gentle either. You made assumptions about me based on things that had nothing to do with my abilities. You dismissed me before you knew anything about me. Maddox nodded miserably. Yes, I did. Now you know better. He looked up at her for the first time. His eyes were wet with shame and something that might have been the beginning of growth. Yes, I do. He walked away without another word. Kira watched him go, knowing that the lesson he had learned today would stay with him for the rest of his career. Perhaps for the rest of his life. That was worth something. Maybe it was worth everything. Colonel Harwood approached last. The commanding officer's face was carefully neutral, but Kira could see the approval in his eyes. Outstanding work, petty officer. You saved lives today. Probably more than we will ever know. Thank you, sir. I will be recommending you for commendation. What you accomplished out there deserves recognition. Vickers appeared at her shoulder as the colonel moved away. The old Master Chief had been watching from the corner of the room, letting the moment unfold without interference. Now he leaned close and spoke quietly. You should know the rest, he said. SEAL Command did not send you here for evaluation. They sent you here because they knew the Wraith was operating in this valley. They knew conventional tactics were not working. They needed someone who could make the shot that no one else could make. Kira absorbed this information. They knew. They suspected. The intelligence was not certain. But they believed you were the only shooter in any branch who had a chance of taking him down. He paused. They were right. The briefing ended. The Marines dispersed to their duties, talking quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed. Kira found herself alone in the TOC, staring at the tactical display that still showed the South Ridge where the Wraith had died. She had done what she came here to do, proven what she came here to prove. But somehow, standing in an empty room, she did not feel triumphant. She felt tired, relieved, and strangely incomplete. That night, in the quiet of her quarters, Kira opened her grandfather's journal for the last time. She turned to the entry she had read 100 times before, the one describing the shot he had made in the Central Highlands in 1968. The same distance, the same 3 wind zones, the same impossible gap between 2 rock formations. But this time, she noticed something she had missed before. A small notation in the margin, written in handwriting even more cramped than usual. Her grandfather's final words on the subject. They said it cannot be done. I did anyway. Someday, someone else will face the same shot. I hope they have the courage to take it. I hope they make the wind speak. I hope they complete what I started. Kira closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. Her grandfather had made the impossible shot 50 years ago, saving lives that no one ever credited him for. Today, she had made the same shot, completing a legacy that had been waiting half a century for its ending. She was not just continuing his story. She was finishing it. The morning after the impossible shot, Kira walked to the Chow Hall and experienced something she had not felt since arriving at FOB Copperhead. Normalcy. Marines nodded as she passed. Not elaborate gestures of respect. Not dramatic acknowledgments of her achievement. Just simple nods, the kind that soldiers gave each other when they recognized a peer. It was a small thing. It was everything. She ate breakfast alone, but the isolation felt different now. Not exclusion, just solitude. When she finished, a young lance corporal approached her table with an expression that mixed nervousness with determination. Petty Officer O'Yelleran. The guys at the range were wondering if you might have some time today. Some of us want to learn about that wind reading technique. If you're willing to teach. Kira studied the young man's face. A week ago, he had probably been among those laughing at Maddox's jokes about dolls. Now he was asking her for instruction. The change was not complete. It might never be complete, but it was a beginning. I will be there at 1400, she said. Bring anyone who wants to learn. The range session drew more Marines than Kira had expected. 15 men stood waiting when she arrived, their rifles ready, their attitudes stripped of the contempt that had defined their earlier interactions. She taught them the basics of wind reading, the techniques her grandfather had developed and Vickers had helped her refine. Not the deep secrets. Those took years to master, but enough to make them better shooters. Enough to keep them alive. Crenshaw arrived halfway through the session. He stood at the edge of the group, watching without speaking, his presence creating a ripple of tension among the assembled Marines. When Kira finished her demonstration, he approached her with a directness that surprised her. That technique, he said, the wind conversation. I want to understand it. Kira looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had tried to destroy her, who had blamed her for things beyond her control, who had let his grief twist in a hatred for anyone who reminded him of his loss. She could refuse him, could walk away and let him live with the consequences of his choices. Instead, she said, it takes years to master, but I can show you where to start. Something shifted in Crenshaw's expression. Not quite gratitude, not quite respect, but something close to both. He nodded once, sharply, and took a position at the range. Teaching him felt strange. The man who had been her enemy was now her student, hanging on her words, following her instructions, struggling to feel what she felt when the wind spoke. He was not a natural. His instincts had been trained in a different direction for too long. But he was trying, and sometimes trying was enough. The Afghan delegation arrived that afternoon. Captain Hassan Nazari of the Afghan National Army led a group of village elders through the FOB gates, their robes bright against the dusty backdrop of the base. Kira was summoned to the command center, where Colonel Harwood waited with an expression that suggested something significant was about to happen. The people of Darwan wished to express their gratitude, Nazari explained through an interpreter. His English was good, but the elders preferred their own language for formal occasions. You saved many lives yesterday, including children. This is not something they will forget. An elderly woman stepped forward, her face weathered by decades of mountain sun and hardship. In her hands, she held a scarf woven from threads of deep blue and gold, the colors of the Afghan sky at dawn. She spoke in Pashto, her voice soft but certain. She says this belonged to the medic's mother, Nazari translated. The man who was shot trying to help the children. His family wants you to have it, as a symbol of their thanks and their respect. Kira accepted the scarf with hands that trembled slightly. The fabric was soft, worn smooth by years of use. It carried the weight of a family's gratitude, of lives saved, of a moment when the impossible had become possible. Thank you, she said. I will treasure this. The elders departed with blessings and promises of friendship. Kira stood in the command center holding the scarf, feeling the humanity of what she had accomplished in a way that numbers and distances could never capture. She had not just made a shot. She had protected people, real people with families and dreams and futures that would now continue because of what she had done. Lieutenant Commander Brandt found her later that evening. SEAL Command is recommending you for the Bronze Star, he told her. Possibly higher. What you did out there changes things, O'Yellerin. Not just for you. For every woman who comes after you. Kira nodded slowly. She understood what he meant. Her shot had been more than a tactical victory. It had been a statement. Proof that capability transcended gender. That excellence could not be denied. That the barriers men built from their fear and prejudice could be shattered by undeniable truth. Master Chief Vickers appeared as Brandt departed. The old sniper's face carried an expression Kira had never seen before. Something that looked almost like peace. Your grandfather would be proud, he said simply. He never got recognized. Kira's voice caught slightly. They buried his records. Buried everything he accomplished. He died without anyone knowing what he did. Vickers placed a hand on her shoulder. You are his recognition now. Every shot you make, every life you save, every mind you change. He is remembered through you. His legacy lives because you carry it forward. Kira felt tears threatening and forced them back. She had cried enough in this place. Now was not the time for grief. Now was the time for acknowledgement, for closure, for the completion of something that had waited 50 years to be finished. Fuentes found her at the range that night, practicing in the darkness as she had done so many times before. He watched her shoot for several minutes before speaking. You ever need a spotter, you call me. He leaned against the range barrier, his posture relaxed. I do not care what branch you are. I do not care what anyone else thinks. You are the real deal, O'Yellerin. I would be honored to work with you. Kira lowered her rifle. Marines and SEALs working together. That is the impossible shot. Fuentes grinned. We just made one of those. They shook hands in the darkness, two warriors from different branches who had found common ground in respect and shared experience. It was not the friendship Kira had expected to find in this place. But it was real, and real was more than she had hoped for. The orders came 3 days later. Her deployment to FOB Copperhead was ending. She had accomplished her mission. Now it was time to return to her regular unit, to continue her career, to carry forward the legacy she had inherited and earned. Kira was packing her gear when the knock came. She opened her door expecting Fuentes or perhaps Vickers. Instead, she found a young woman in marine utilities, barely out of boot camp, with dark skin and nervous eyes that reminded Kira of herself a decade ago. Petty Officer O'Yellerin, the young Marine said, I am PFC Amar Diallo. I heard about what you did. She straightened her shoulders, forcing confidence into her voice. I start sniper school next month. I was hoping, if you have time, you might give me some advice. Kira stepped aside and let PFC Amar Diallo enter her quarters. The young Marine moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that every moment of this encounter mattered. She sat on the edge of the footlocker when Kira gestured toward it, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes bright with hope and uncertainty. Sniper school, Kira said, settling onto her cot across from the young woman. That is a hard road. I know. Amara's voice was steady despite her obvious nervousness. I have heard the statistics. I know how many wash out. I know it will be harder for me than for most. Because you are a woman. Because I am a woman. Because I am black. Because I come from a place where people like me are not supposed to want things like this. Amara lifted her chin slightly. But I want it anyway. Kira studied the young Marine's face. She saw herself in those determined eyes. Saw her grandfather. Saw every person who had ever been told they did not belong and had refused to accept the limitation. They will doubt you, Kira said. She did not soften the words. Amara needed truth, not comfort. Every day, every shot, every time you think you have proven yourself, someone new will come along who needs convincing. They will tell you that you do not belong, that you are a distraction, that you are a liability, that you should go back to wherever you came from and leave the real work to people who were born for it. Amara's jaw tightened. What do I do? You let them talk. Kira leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone her grandfather had used when teaching her the most important lessons. And then you let your rifle answer. You make shots they cannot make. You see things they cannot see. You become so good that denying your ability requires denying reality itself. And eventually, some of them will come around. Not all, never all, but enough. The young Marine nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Kira could see her filing them away, storing them for the moments when doubt would threaten to overwhelm her. Those moments would come. They always came. But now Amara would have something to hold on to when they did. Kira reached into her pack and withdrew the leather journal that had traveled with her across oceans and continents and decades. The pages were yellow with age, the binding worn soft by countless hands. Her grandfather's handwriting filled every page, a record of wisdom and experience that had guided her through her darkest moments. This belonged to the greatest sniper I have ever known, Kira said, holding the journal out to Amara. His name was Isaiah O'Yelleran. He was my grandfather. He served in Vietnam and made shots that should have been impossible. He saved dozens of lives. And when he came home, they buried his records, buried his achievements. Let him die without a single medal or recognition because the men in charge could not accept what a black man from Montana could do with a rifle. Amara's eyes widened as she took the journal. Her fingers traced the worn leather cover with something approaching reverence. This is your family's history. It is, and now I'm giving it to you. But why? Amara looked up, confusion and gratitude warring in her expression. Why would you give something this precious to someone you just met? Kira smiled. Because legacy is not about holding on. It is about passing forward. My grandfather gave his knowledge to me. I used it to make a shot that people said was impossible. Now you will read his words, learn his techniques, and someday you will make your own impossible shot. And when you do, you will find someone else to pass it forward to. Amara clutched the journal against her chest. I will not let you down. You will not let yourself down. Kira stood, signaling that their time together was ending. That is what matters. Not me. Not my grandfather. You. The departure ceremony was small and informal, exactly as Kira would have wanted. A handful of Marines gathered near the helicopter landing zone as she walked toward the aircraft that would carry her away from FOB Copperhead. Fuentes was there, and Vickers and Colonel Harwood. Even Maddox stood at the edge of the group, his posture respectful in a way it had never been before. Crenshaw approached her last. The gunnery sergeant who had been her enemy, then her reluctant witness, then her student, stood before her with something in his hand. A small metal pin, polished to a bright shine despite years of wear. Scout sniper insignia, he said, holding it out to her. I know you're Navy. I know it is not your branch. But you earned this, more than anyone I have ever trained. Kira took the pin and felt its weight in her palm. Such a small thing to carry so much meaning. Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. Wade. He almost smiled. After what you did, I think you can call me Wade. She pocketed the pin and extended her hand. He shook it firmly, and in that grip was everything that had passed between them. The hostility, the doubt, The transformation. The respect that had been earned through undeniable truth. The helicopter's rotors began to spin. Kira walked toward the aircraft, her pack on her shoulder, the Afghan scarf wrapped around her neck. Her grandfather's legacy passed forward to a new generation. As she reached the door, she turned back for one final look. The Marines had formed a line. Not ordered to. Not required to. They had simply arranged themselves in a row and raised their hands in salute. Crenshaw, Fuentes, Maddox, the others who had watched her arrive with contempt and now watch her leave with respect. Kira returned the salute, holding it for a long moment. Then she climbed aboard the helicopter and settled into her seat as the aircraft lifted off. Through the window, she watched FOB Copperhead shrink beneath her. The Tactical Operations Center. The range where she had proven herself. The overlook where she had taken position on the morning of the impossible shot. And in the distance, rising against the Afghan sky, the spine. The ridge where the Wraith had died. Where her bullet had threaded an 18-inch gap across 1,847 meters and changed everything. She thought about her grandfather, making the same shot 50 years ago in a different war. She thought about Amara, who would someday make her own impossible shot in a war that had not yet begun. She thought about all the women who would come after, who would face the same doubts and the same barriers and the same voices telling them they did not belong. The mocking words came back to her. Corporal Maddox, smirking in her doorway on that first day. Go play with dolls. Kira Smythe. She did not play with dolls. She played with wind, with distance, with physics and probability and the thin line between possible and impossible. She played a game that most people could not even understand, let alone master. And she played to win. The helicopter banked toward the east, carrying her away from the mountains and the memories and the place where she had completed her grandfather's legacy. Below her, the Afghan landscape spread out in shades of brown and gold, beautiful and brutal and indifferent to the struggles of the people who fought across its surface. But Kira was not indifferent. She carried the weight of those who had come before and the hope of those who would come after. She carried a legacy that had waited 50 years to be finished. She carried proof that the impossible was only impossible until someone refused to accept the limitation. The wind conversation, her grandfather had called it, the dialogue between shooter and sky that made impossible shots possible. Kira had learned to speak that language, had used it to save lives and change minds and honor a man who had never received the recognition he deserved. Now that conversation would continue. Through Amara. Through every woman who picked up a rifle and refused to be told she did not belong. Through every impossible shot that shattered the barriers built by fear and prejudice and small-minded certainty. Legacy was not about holding on. It was about passing forward. And Kira O'Yelleran had passed hers forward to a future that was already beginning to unfold. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what moment hit you hardest, or tell us about someone you know who had to prove themselves against impossible odds.